bring into this conversation as we wait for the headlines from those documents. Nada Bacco, CNN legal national security analyst, and our legal analyst, Laura Coates, also a former federal prosecutor. Laura Coates, to you, so many questions, and I wonder what is top of mind for you as you think about all of these transcripts of these hours-long interview. What will you be looking for most?
Well, one, I expect to see a great deal of redactions before they're actually released to everyone to not give us the full picture. But what is remaining with the redactions included in there, I'm looking to see whether or not anybody was truly comprehensively responsive. Remember, one of the main critiques people have had about these behind closed door meetings is about the lack of enforcement and the lack of trying to get people to try to answer all of the questions thoroughly and not hide behind some exertion of privilege or hide behind some other reason not to answer the question. So I'll be curious to see where their gaps is. Because if there are gaps in the questions and in the answers that are asked, that can lead you to conclude a number of things. Also, I'm looking to figure out whether anyone can answer the question why and what people knew at the time of the meeting. There's been a lot of confusion, Poppy, about whether or not this was a meeting about the Magnitsky Act, about Russian adoption, what was known before. And also, I'm also trying to figure out, because Kushner and Manafort didn't actually sit for an interview, I don't believe, but they had written responses. So I'm curious to read the, I'm sure, highly vetted, curated responses from those two gentlemen, particularly because Manafort finds himself with a trial coming down the road.
No, the big deal here is the transcript of the testimony from Donald Trump Jr. That is what we will see any second right now. The other thing that could be potentially very interesting is the written answers from Natalia Veselnitskaya. That is the Russian lawyer, Nada, who was at this meeting and who was since very recently and very publicly admitted to being a Russian informant. So what would you look for in her written response?
From my perspective, especially from the perspective of somebody who's trying to groom a possible candidate that they can recruit and then therefore work for them and do their bidding, I'd be looking for signals that she was actually intending to work with either Donald Trump Jr. or through Rob Goldstone, where she's trying to actually set the stage for further conversations down the road that would lead them to then working with the Trump campaign. Anything that would signal basically a spy operation is what I would be looking for at this point. It might not be incredibly blatant in her language, but it could be just signals that she is using to actually try to recruit some of these individuals to then have this further relationship with.
So, Evan, we've just received sort of the first big headline out of these thousands of pages of transcripts from the Judiciary Committee's interviews. And the headline here is that Donald Trump Jr. testified under oath in front of the committee that he had never spoken to his father about drafting one of those initial statements trying to explain this meeting on July 8th. I think we should just read it.
Yeah, let me read it, because actually the transcript here isn't quite so declarative here. This is one of the questions to Donald Trump Jr. The Washington Post has since reported that your father was involved in drafting your July 8th statement. Is that correct? Trump Jr. responds, I don't know. I never spoke to my father about it. Do you know who did draft the statement? He responds, well, there were numerous statements drafted with counsel and other people were involved and, opined. To the best of your knowledge, did the president provide any edits to the statements or other input? He responds, he may have commented through Hope Hicks.
His then spokesperson.
This goes on. And do you know if his comments provided through Hope Hicks were incorporated into the final statement? Donald Trump Jr. responds, I believe some may have been, but this was an effort through lots of people, mostly counsel. Question, did you ask him to provide any assistance with the statement? He says, no. She asked if I wanted to actually speak to him, and I chose not to because I didn't want to bring him into something that he had nothing to do with.
So that is, Don Jr., Evan, it seems to be explaining, no, I didn't speak to my father about drafting this statement, then admitting at the end because he didn't want to bring his father into it because it could be more than just not a good look for his father. There could be legal implications. But we know how close, Evan, Hope Hicks was to President Trump. So speaking to her or getting communication from her about what his father thought should go into this statement, what's the difference?
Well, exactly. That's exactly right. And I think what Don Jr., at least in the first answer you see there, he's sort of being a little lawyerly, and he's trying to be very technical about what he's saying, whether he spoke to the president or not. As far as we know, there was a lot of what was happening is these people were on Air Force One, the president, Hope Hicks, Jared Kushner, they're all on Air Force One, and they're communicating with Donald Trump Jr. and his lawyers in New York, as well as Jared Kushner's attorneys here in Washington, D.C. And there are phone calls going back and forth between the lawyers and at least the lawyers and perhaps Don Jr., we don't know, and Air Force One. It appears that Hope Hicks was doing the talking on behalf of the president. And this is why this is a very important piece of this story, simply because by doing this aboard Air Force One, the president essentially was using government employees, people who work for the White House, to handle the most personal of matters. This is something having to do with his son, right? Keep in mind, Donald Trump Jr. doesn't work for the government, so he doesn't really have to explain anything, except that his father brings this upon, makes this into essentially a federal investigation. You know?
And to be clear, Donald Trump Jr. in this testimony is admitting, if not directly, to the possibility that his father did dictate the response. He may have commented through Hope Hicks. I believe there may have been some. This was an effort through lots of people, mostly counsel. But this is saying that he was involved. Let me just read you the Trump Jr. comment on the release right now, so you have it out there, and you can include that in your calculations here. I appreciate the opportunity, Trump Jr. says, to have assisted the Judiciary Committee in its inquiry. The public can now see that for over 5 hours, I answered every question asked and was candid and forthright with the committee. I once again thank Chairman Grassley and Ranking Member Feinstein, as well as the other members of the committee and their staff, for their courtesy and professionalism.
Important to note that. I would just note, too, that the statement we're talking about that Don Jr. was just questioned about, which John read, is the July 8th statement, which basically says this meeting was much ado about nothing. This meeting was about Russian adoptions. There was no follow-up. There was no there. That's a big part of why this matters.
You know, Laura Coates, and if you read this testimony with Donald Trump Jr. basically saying my father communicated through Hope Hicks on this, you know that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is going to be asking Hope Hicks about this, and Hope Hicks no doubt faced questions about this from the committees as well.
Of course he should. And you know, what I heard when you were reading the actual transcript are two things. I heard somebody who was trying to hedge under two concepts. Plausible deniability, that if there is someone who's one removed from the President of the United States and his father, that somehow he could take cover and not having had a direct conversation. And the second issue here is the idea that he was trying to, and floundering in his effort to do so, talk about the attorney-client privilege. It's mostly through counsel, trying to hedge and say, perhaps I can't talk about these issues. Remember, he was criticized on that very point because you don't have attorney-client privilege if you're not talking to your own attorney and anyone else is in the room, including somebody like Hope Hicks. And so his attempt to actually, as he says, comprehensively and candidly answer these questions, in my mind, raise additional questions and suspicion, particularly because on Air Force One, who's riding on it? The President of the United States. And a lot of the testimony that's coming out, and as we're combing through the transcripts, indicate about a lot of the anxiety that took place once they realized that the meeting had been made public and the knowledge of the meeting had actually become public knowledge at this point in time. And so all the anxiety and the buildup of how to address it, how to resolve it, you had the New York Times breathing down his neck trying to get a response from Donald Trump Jr., and you had somebody in a position who is now president, but at the time of the meeting was not. And remember, Steve Bannon, who I know was not around at the time of this July 2016, I believe, meeting, you still had him saying he questioned and called it traitorous whether or not Donald Trump Jr. told his father or walked them down to the floor that he was sitting on. There are still a lot of questions.
Stay with us to answer those questions, okay? We're getting more of these headlines out of these thousands of pages of transcripts, much more of the breaking news ahead.